I used to work as a park ranger in Chiricahua National Park in Arizona. My job was pretty boring, but I was used to the lonely hours of darkness spent patrolling the winding roads throughout the park. A lot of my friends would always say I was brave for always being out in the desolate wilderness alone at night, but to me, it really wasn't that scary. I guess it's something that a lot of people would prefer not to do, but something about the untouched beauty of the night drew me into it. This night started off no different. I was at my post chatting over the radio with my partner Paul, who was wrapping up at the visitor center. I remember specifically talking to him on the radio about our favorite spots we've each found on our shifts, and the ones we still wanted to explore. We had each already done our nightly safety check, and now I was about to pick him up for our leisurely cruise around the park. Then, Paul yawned and said he had to go use the restroom. "I'll be back in a few minutes," he said as he put down the radio. I got in my car to go pick him up for our patrol, which was about 5 minutes away. His post was at the visitor center, which had the cleanest bathrooms, so I was planning on following suit before we set out. When I arrived at the center, I saw that Paul wasn't outside waiting for me yet, so I got out of my truck and headed towards the bathrooms. I opened up the door, expecting to see Paul's feet in the stall, but the room was empty. I assumed he must have ran back inside, so I did my business and went back out to my truck. When I opened the door, I grabbed the radio and said, "I'm outside, let's get going," but there was no response. I waited a few minutes before getting up and grabbing the building keys to go get him inside. When I got in the building, I searched all around, but he was nowhere to be found. That's when I started getting a little panicked, since this was very unlikely of him. Just then, my boss from the station radioed in, asking if we left yet. I quickly radioed back to the station and told him that I couldn't find Paul. He started asking me a ton of questions, but I couldn't answer any of them. I had no idea where he was. All I said was to get here as soon as possible. I kept radioing in for Paul, but he still wasn't responding. I ran outside and yelled his name in the parking lot, completely losing my voice from all the screaming. I was completely beside myself. I eventually looked at my watch, seeing that it was already past 11 and there was still no word from Paul. When my boss arrived, he became even more worried after seeing the look on my face. He went inside and accessed the security camera footage facing the bathrooms, and I waited in total suspense as he scrolled through the feed. Suddenly, he caught Paul on the camera walking out to the bathroom at 10:32 p.m. That's when he let the feed run at normal speed. A couple minutes later, Paul walked out of the bathroom and took a few steps toward the visitor center, before he stopped and turned around towards the woods behind the bathroom facility, using his flashlight. My heart began to race as my eyes stayed glued on the CCTV screen. The following seconds showed Paul walking into the woods, looking side to side, then disappearing as he walked deeper into the woods. My boss kept the feed running as I continued radioing into Paul, hoping for a response. The police showed up and searched the area he disappeared in, but stopped after the first hour, saying that it was too dark and they weren't properly prepared. Search and rescue teams showed up at sunrise the next morning, and they searched for the next several days, but nobody ever found him. Well, none of us ever heard from Paul again, and whatever happened to him is still unknown. When I was 11 and my older cousin was 13, we'd often go exploring in the Cuyahoga County National Park. It was conveniently located right by my house. The distance was short enough to walk there, and on many occasions, we'd spend a good majority of the day there exploring the woods. One time though, in particular, didn't turn out as planned. It was early spring, and the snow that was covering the woods for the past several months was finally beginning to melt. We decided to set out for a day-long adventure, and maybe find a new hangout spot in the process. We were pretty familiar with most of the area by my house, given that we'd practically been going there ever since we could walk. Like usual, we entered in through the woods that led us to a towpath that stretched for miles and miles ahead. We walked that path until it branched off into a hiking trail, which we'd take for another mile or so, before reaching some park benches, where we'd usually take a break and hang out. Once we reached that point, my cousin suggested that we should take the trail even further, then find a new hangout spot. I agreed, and we continued walking down the trail. We ended up walking deeper into the woods than we ever had at that point, and I was starting to get a little bit nervous that we'd get lost. My cousin reassured me though, explaining that all we had to do was follow the trail the opposite direction to get back. We walked for miles, and each of us were in a bit of a daze as we sort of zoned out on the hike. As we continued on, we each noticed something that we'd never seen before. Through the barren trees, tucked off to the side of the trail, was a wooden cabin. It definitely looked eerie, being that it was seemingly in the middle of nowhere, but again, we were in the national park. They had little cabins all over the area for people to rent out. By the looks of it, it seemed abandoned, and my cousin really wanted to check it out. Although a little frightened, I followed behind as he approached it. We crept around it, wondering how someone would even find this to rent out. As we reached the backside of the cabin, I noticed another trail that must have led to a parking lot. We were both pretty excited at the sight of our new discovery, and our curiosity continued to grow. We started looking into the windows, seeing that the inside of the cabin looked extremely nice. From what I could see, there was a couch, TV, fireplace, and even a bunk bed in another room. Seeing that was enough to draw me in even more, and out of curiosity, we tried the front door to see if it was unlocked. As soon as my cousin turned the door handle, we both looked at each other in disbelief as the door creaked open. Although the door was now partially opened, I decided to knock, just in case someone was staying there. But after trying a few times, it was obvious that it was empty. Someone must have forgotten to lock it when they left, but we were quite happy they did. The inside of the cabin was beautiful, and I threw myself onto the bunk bed, thankful that I had it to rest on, instead of the wooden park benches miles back. My cousin opened the fridge and yelled for me to check it out when he looked at me with pure excitement. I rolled out of bed and walked to the fridge to see that it was fully stocked with tons of food. Although we were definitely snooping, we didn't want to steal or be any more intrusive than we already were, so we closed it up and kept exploring the inside. More time passed, and by that point, we were kicked back on the couch watching some TV, resting up to make our return back home. Right when we were about to leave, my cousin suggested that we'd at least drink some water before going, since we hadn't had any all day. I was definitely dehydrated, so we made our way into the kitchen. Not wanting to leave a trace, I turned on the faucet and drank from it like a water fountain, then went back in the living room to turn off the TV. As my cousin was drinking in the kitchen, he frantically spun around and said, "Someone's coming." My stomach dropped, and I crept into the kitchen to see what he was talking about. Sure enough, there was a man walking down the trail coming directly towards the cabin. As soon as I saw him, I completely regretted it, because I made direct eye contact with him. I watched in total fear as he started running towards us, and we instantly turned around and bolted for the front door. By the time we reached the door and opened it, he was standing right there. He looked to be in his 40s, wearing a plaid shirt, jeans, and beige boots. Despite the mean look on his face, he kindly said, "What are you guys doing here?" I was speechless, but my cousin mustered up the words to answer. We were just exploring. I'm sorry, we'll go now." He chuckled and said, "No worries. You guys are more than welcome to stay here and hang out." My cousin and I looked at each other, and I said, "Thank you, but we should get going now. Sorry again." I'd always been taught not to talk to strangers, but in this situation, I didn't really have a choice. I wasn't too worried yet because he initially came off as a nice person, but that all changed when he spoke again. "You guys really shouldn't be leaving this late. It's gonna be dark soon. Why don't you guys just stay here for the night?" My cousin and I weren't the smartest, but we definitely weren't idiots. Every red flag we'd been taught as kids were going off in our heads, and we knew we needed to leave right away, but this guy was blocking the only exit we had. Without saying anything else, he took a step forward into the cabin, closing and locking the door behind him. I was terrified and knew we were in a dangerous situation. He sat us down on the couch and flipped on the TV before sitting down right next to us on a chair. I could feel myself shaking, but tried my hardest not to look nervous on the outside. After several torturous minutes, he got up and started walking towards the bathroom, mentioning that it was time to go to bed soon, as he gestured toward the master bedroom. As soon as he walked into the bathroom, he started peeing, all while leaving the door wide open so he'd have a clear view of us. I looked at my cousin out of the corner of my eye, trying not to make it too obvious. At that point, I knew we had the same idea. Without saying anything, we both shot up off the couch and made a beeline to the door. He obviously saw this and started yelling at us to stop, but before he could even make it out of the bathroom, we were already out the door. We went straight to the trail we came from and sprinted faster than we ever had in our entire lives. I turned around to see him just standing by the door, but that didn't stop us from getting the hell out of there. Our adrenaline carried each of us far enough to the towpath, and by then, the guy was out of sight. We didn't stop once and made it straight back to my house, where my parents were waiting inside, mad that we were home this late. Neither of us told our parents about our encounter, worried that we'd get in trouble for breaking into the cabin. I don't know what that guy's exact intentions were, but the older I get, the more obvious it is to me. My cousin and I narrowly escaped a situation that could have significantly altered the course of our lives, and we've never seen that creep since. When I was a child, my dad would always take me camping with him, and I always remembered loving it. However, ever since he passed away when I was little, I hadn't been camping since I was probably 12 or 13, so on this weekend, my dreams of camping again had finally become a reality. My husband of 8 years had just left me, and I was back to living in a one-bedroom studio apartment. I needed an escape, a fresh start. I was headed to the Great Smoky Mountains in Tennessee for a weekend of alone time, away from the old life I was so desperate to leave. I arrived at the park on a Friday evening. As I pulled into the vast, wooded grounds, I already felt a substantial difference in the air. Everything seemed calmer and much more peaceful. I found my campsite and began unloading my gear and supplies before the darkness of the night set in. Once I started to settle in, I decided to make myself something to eat. I made a small fire and cooked up some instant ramen noodles. When I finished, I felt comfortable and soon became tired, so I lowered the fire and made my way to my tent. I zipped my tent shut and crawled into my sleeping bag, exhausted from all the driving. As I was laying there with my thoughts racing, I heard a noise. I stopped and strained my ears. It almost sounded like something stepped on a twig. I jumped up and made my way to the tent flap. I scanned the area around me, but since the fire wasn't providing much light, it was mostly just darkness. I crawled back into my sleeping bag and thought about the noise, realizing that it was probably just an animal or wood popping in the fire. I laughed at myself, not expecting to get this scared at the slightest sound. I crawled back into my sleeping bag and closed my eyes, willing myself to fall asleep. The next morning, I woke up early, feeling much better than the night before. I made breakfast, had some coffee, and began to explore the area. I hiked for what felt like hours, all while feeling a sense of happiness, which was something I hadn't felt in a long time. As the day wore on, I swam in the river, and while I cooled off, I couldn't help but feel like someone was watching me. I kept hearing footsteps, but again, I assumed it was just an animal and that I was freaking myself out. After dinner, I wandered around a bit longer, taking in all the sights and sounds of everything. I was growing used to the sounds that once sounded so foreign to me. My worries faded away, and I stopped feeling so on edge. The next morning, I made some breakfast and prepared to go visit a really cool waterfall. I had mapped out a hiking route that was about 10 miles away. Going into this, I had overestimated my endurance. Once I reached mile 5, I was already beat, and I had to keep taking breaks. With each mile after that, I grew more and more tired. There were a lot of hills, and I was walking on an incline for most of the way after that. I was determined though, and ended up trudging my way along to the waterfall. After about 3.5 hours, I finally made it there. The sight was beautiful, and I ended up staying there for a few hours, just admiring the scenery. I had packed a lot of food and water with me, knowing I'd probably hang out there for a while. Once 4 o'clock rolled around, I decided to start the trek back so I'd make it back to my campsite before dark. I was going at a much better pace this time, enjoying the slight decline on the first few miles. I was feeling better about myself already, knowing that I really needed this. As the sun started to set, my positive mood shifted into a worried one when I realized how dark it was already getting. The trees were starting to look more and more like shadows, so I picked up the pace, starting to panic a little. Thankfully, I reached my last landmark, and I knew my campsite was just a few 100 feet away. As I reached the clearing out of the woods and to my tent, I noticed that my tent zipper was open. I was absolutely positive that I had closed it, in an effort to keep the bugs out. I started second-guessing myself, until I reached the site. Instantly, I noticed that someone had definitely been there. Inside my tent, my bags were all ripped open and my clothes were scattered everywhere. I started panicking, hoping that they didn't take my purse. When I reached in to grab the bag my purse was in, I was shocked. Everything inside was still there, completely untouched. I felt a little relieved, but still freaked out, knowing that whoever it was had to have known I was staying there and went through my stuff. I looked around, but saw nothing. I decided that it would be dumb to stay, so I started packing up all of my stuff. My car was about a quarter mile away, parked in a dirt parking lot. My feet ached with every step, exhausted from my hike and the additional weight on my back. I walked down the sidewalk-sized dirt road with every intention of getting out of there fast. Just before I reached my car, I noticed a campsite that wasn't there previously. I saw a guy sitting on a log in front of a fire with a blank expression on his face. As soon as he saw me, he sat up really quickly and turned to the tent behind him. I was definitely startled that he got up so fast, and I didn't understand why he was acting so frantic. Once I got to my car, I opened the trunk to throw my stuff in before I heard someone yelling at me. I turned around to see that another guy had emerged out of the tent. Although it was dark, I could tell that they had long, unkempt beards. They shouted at me to wait, but I was too scared. I got in my car and drove off as fast as I could, all while watching them scream stuff at me through my rearview mirror. I have no idea where they came from, since my car was the only one in the parking lot. I even purposely picked a very desolate campsite to avoid running into any people. Looking back now, I'm so glad I left that night. I'm not sure why they decided to camp right by both my car and my campsite. It definitely wasn't a coincidence. They knew where I was the whole time, and that terrifies me. If I hadn't left that campsite, who knows what would have happened to me.